Okay, so I think we can get started. Hi there, my name's Steve Richards. I'm here to talk about Drupal, Jenkins, testing basically, setting up a framework for testing your code. A little bit about me. Been a Drupal developer for just over 6 years. Been working in PHP for just over 10 years. I'm a husband, cyclist, frustrated rock star. But now I'm the lead developer for Miggle. We're based in Brighton. We work on a number of different intermediate to large projects for organisations such as NHS, New Zealand, Friday Media Group, and NBC Universal. So my motivations for kind of doing this talk today, over the last year, I attended a number of Drupal camps and Drupal cons, and certainly one of the biggest things I took away from that is that as our team was getting bigger, we needed to make our processes better, stronger, basically encourage best practices. So every time we hired a new person, we needed to somehow have a framework for encouraging best practices amongst those people. We needed to ensure that we were delivering quality as we increased the size of our team. And we needed to be able to release more frequently, but still be able to do that reliably. And hopefully, in the process, develop more robust solutions and deploy with confidence. So how do we go about improving quality control? I mean, essentially, we're looking to write better code by adhering to Drupal coding standards. So we want to evaluate the complexity of the code that we're writing, and we want to detect the messy, copy-pasted code potentially, validate that our code is achieving the desired objectives. And that could be done obviously with simple tests. If you were in here for the session before, using code exception, or using BHAT tests, and basically find a way to automate these labour-intensive tasks. So my requirements personally, I wanted to create something that was going to act as a template, something that would be reusable and future-proof, and something that could be a starting point for all of our future projects. I wanted something that was open source, that was freely being used by the rest of the community, something that I could find lots of information about, and that would give me an opportunity to report any failures within the code and detect any of those issues. And most importantly, email the accountable team members for those issues. And something that would intercept obvious issues. I'm sure I wouldn't be the first person to say when something like this ended up on a production site, and if you didn't have Devel enabled, then obviously that takes down the entire site.
And you're not going to have Devel enabled on production.
Well, it has happened. But yeah, basically detect those obvious issues before they reach the stakeholders. And so in the process, create some sort of development pipeline which will basically protect the stage and the live environments from any of those particular issues, and ensure that code quality, validate everything before the client ever sees it. Continuously integrating that. So I found that was kind of a barrier for entry. So there's a lot of people talking about it, and there's a lot of information about it, but what there wasn't was necessarily a user guide that would basically take you through setting up a Jenkins server, putting all of these things in place, and actually kind of getting you from point A to B. So what I'm hoping to deliver with this session today is to kind of take you through the process of getting from just having a code base right through to having a full Jenkins setup that will take you through that automated procedure. So certainly at DrupalCon, at Drupal camps that I've been to this year, these words are all being thrown around, and without any context, they don't necessarily mean anything to anyone. So there's plenty of buzzwords, there's plenty of acronyms, and they obviously are very relevant, and they all mean a hell of a lot, but if you're coming from just having been a Drupal themer, or just having done some Drupal module development, none of this really kind of makes sense. And it's all kind of things which are very applicable if you're from a software background, and I think the Drupal community is certainly full of a lot of people who aren't necessarily from classic software backgrounds, and certainly frustrated rock stars kind of struggle with kind of working out what all of this stuff means. So straight off the bat, I found some really good resources that talked about Jenkins. So Jenkins is a continuous integration application. It allows you to automate tasks, and it has a huge library of plugins. It allows you to trigger tasks from other jobs so that you can have downstream and upstream jobs that basically can form the components of your pipeline. And you can trigger it from GitHub, for example, so that if someone pushes something to GitHub, you can have that start things on Jenkins. Jenkins can also be used to report those successes and failures. I'll cover that in a bit more detail a bit later on. And you can also use Jenkins to communicate with other servers. And historically, that's something which we've used Jenkins a lot for, to actually take our shell commands, run those on different machines, and be able to kind of do that in a kind of repeatable and reliable way. So this isn't a new concept. This is certainly something that a lot of people have talked about before, and I'm hoping that kind of the twist that I'm putting on it will help a lot of people to kind of onboard to this process. But these two links here are essentially the kind of the key starting points that everyone should kind of look at, really. So the top one there is the Jenkins PHP template. Essentially, this is a Jenkins PHP Phing template that has been written that kind of outlines generally how you would build out that process. The one below here, this is the Drupal specific one. It basically copies the first one, but then kind of puts in some kind of Drupal specifics in there. So now I'm going to go through the process of creating your own continuous integration setup. So I'm going to cover the tools that we'll need to basically put that together, the requirements that those tools have, and then some guidelines around that. And I was going to do a live demo, but I thought a screencast might be a little bit more reliable. So I've got a few videos that I'll run through, and if I can remember exactly what I did, then I'll basically explain everything. Then if we have some time at the end, like I said, I haven't necessarily timed this, so hopefully we won't overrun, but if I have some time at the end, then we'll go through the code as well. So the toolbox that I'm using for this, has anyone here used DigitalOcean for anything? So I've started using DigitalOcean over the last year. It's just brilliant as a service for just building out any sort of servers. They charge by the day, is it, or by the hour? Does anyone know? I can't remember. It's by the, yeah, but in any case, they charge incrementally rather than having to kind of subscribe to anything. So it's kind of like a pay-as-you-go service. So I find it really useful for just building stuff up and then tearing it down. You can also kind of store images of stuff that you've built up as well. They've got a very good API. If anyone caught session at last year's Drupal Camp London on Ansible, there was a really good demo of someone basically using Ansible to trigger building 10 different DigitalOcean boxes all on their API. I'll be using Ubuntu just because that's my kind of distro of choice. We'll be using Jenkins, numerous plugins. We'll also be using GitHub, specifically GitHub because it has good compatibility with Jenkins, and Composer. So, has anyone here not heard of Composer? Good. So Composer is a PHP dependency manager, so we'll be using that. And we'll also be using Phing. So Phing is essentially an automation tool. It's based on PHP, uses XML for building up dependencies. It's based on something called Apache. And we'll be doing automated testing using simple test and VHAP. And obviously Drupal, and in this case with SQLite, so the Jenkins PHP template, the Drupal PHP template, both of them use SQLite as a throwaway database that kind of gets set up with your continuous integration setup. So how are we going to evaluate code quality? So we'll use Coda for code analysis, and then together with that PHP template, there's a number of different libraries which we're going to download using Composer, and these are going to basically allow us to run metrics against that code. So there's a duplicate code detection plugin which we'll be using, PHP mess detection and copy-paste detection, and a tool for JS and CSS linting. So traditionally, the templates which you will see on the slide I showed you earlier use pair to manage the dependencies. So why Composer? Well, Composer is essentially a PHP package manager as an alternative to pair, but in this case, we're using it to allow us to manage dependencies on a per project basis. It will require some additional changes to your Jenkins setup because of essentially those packages aren't going to be available on a server-wide basis, so you have to tell the Jenkins user where they're going to be. And my feeling is that going from Jenkins to a hosted continuous integration setup, you'll have a better transition if you already have Composer in your library. So I didn't realise how ridiculously small this was going to be, but this is essentially the layout of our Composer file. There's a full walkthrough with all the documentation and the code online. So at the end I'll share the link and everyone can kind of take a look at the code in their own time. So a little bit about Phing. As I said, it's a build automation tool. It's based on Apache Ant. The Drupal community have been using this for a long time. I'm certain that there's something better, so I would like to speak to you, sir, at the end about Ansible for this instead. But it's got good integration with Jenkins. Specifically, and I'll show you the build process later, you can actually see bookmarks to where each of the Phing targets is run, so actually debugging the process is quite easy. It's XML and essentially it's PHP based, so extending it would be as simple as kind of writing your own classes. And it's got a drush integration plugin, so you can essentially run kind of native drush stuff with it. So here's an example of a Phing target. So anyone who may have used Apache Ant or any sort of dependency management deployment tool, essentially you create different targets that have different dependencies, and if you try and run one target that has other dependencies, it will run the other dependencies first until it's satisfied all the dependencies, and then you kind of move along in the build process. And then the kind of drush integration for that, essentially you have certain kind of drush XML commands and you can pass options into as you would if you were just creating normal drush commands. The key file that you define all the environment variables is called build.default.properties. This allows you to specify certain variables that apply to that specific project. It can be overridden in Jenkins, so that integration in Jenkins extends right back up the tree so that you can, rather than have to commit any changes in, if you have just literally something that applies to one specific environment in that Jenkins job, you can tell it to use a certain URL, or you can tell it to use a certain install profile. You can also have multiple properties files. So one of the projects I looked at as part of this is something called Drupal Ignite. Has anyone used that at all? So it's Similar sort of setup, but it's kind of more for kind of getting your sites and actually deploying them to kind of production and staging environments. So in that case, you kind of have a way of kind of being able to manage the stage and the live and your development environments and have certain just property files which apply to just those environments. So the format of that properties file is pretty straightforward, where you just define variables where you might say the project code prefix is master, for example, or the project code custom module might be master dependency in this case. And then those get fed into your targets by specifying variables like this, where it's dollar, curly brackets, and then the variable. And so one of the key guidelines you have to follow when you're putting together anything that's going to follow any level of automation is following like really strict guidelines. Standardization is 100% the key to making something that is repeatable and is flexible and yet is kind of reliable. And naming conventions are really the key for that. Applying standard directory structures so you always know where something's going to be, and then your automation tool basically knows where something's going to live. And adding a standard prefix for all your projects. So that might be a 3-letter key prefix that you use for all your features and all your custom modules, and that's really key when it comes to putting the whole thing together. The way that the template works is it looks for certain prefixes within your module, within your site's or modules directory, and those are the ones that it's going to test. So you don't necessarily want to be testing all of Drupal core or anything contra. We're trusting that Drupal.org is taking care of that. We're just kind of evaluating the code that's kind of specific to us. And so the directory structure that I'm using for this specific setup is to essentially have all of my build tools, anything that's non-Drupal specific, basically to sit at this root level, and then to have Drupal installed in a doc root directory. This just means that then you know that everything that lives in doc root is Drupal, and then everything else can just be kind of any tools that you want to use for the project. So that might be things like Vapor files and anything else you're keeping there. Okay, so now I'm going to kind of go through the screencast and kind of take you through the whole process of kind of just setting it up and getting it running. So this is the GitHub repo which I've set up for this. It's a work in progress, but it should get through the whole process and should work. But at the end, yeah, I'll share another link to it. There's a full wiki page that basically does it step by step as well and kind of outlines how to go through the process. Right. Okay, so I'm just starting off here, just creating a droplet on DigitalOcean. I have done some cutting and paste to kind of shorten things down a little bit, so events don't necessarily happen in real time, but they're pretty close to it. I'll just sped up things a little bit. But yeah, so creating any sort of box on here is pretty straightforward. If you've got your SSH keys already set up, you can just click that and it automatically adds your SSH keys to your DigitalOcean box. The requirement to get this whole process set up is at least a 1 gig slice, really. So I tried it with a 500 meg one, and it just didn't like it when it got to the composer dependency stage. So yeah, at least a 1 gig box. So now I'm SSHing into the server. So that's all pretty standard stuff. So the first steps are essentially to install Jenkins. There's essentially 2 different commands that you need to do. I'm off here copying and pasting the URL from somewhere and then pasting it in. And so what we're just getting here is the apps key in order to make our repository recognize this later down the line. And then the next is to just basically add that to the sources file so that when we do apt get, it will know that that's a repository it can use. Now I'm going to update the repositories so that we're essentially putting down all the latest of everything. And then it's just a case of just going apt-get install Jenkins. Definitely should have sped this bit up. So, has anyone gone through this process already themselves? I imagine a number of people have been curious at some point to start Jenkins. No? Yeah? Cool. And yeah, then it's just a case of starting Jenkins. This will start it as a service. There's a number of other ways you can run Jenkins, but this, at least with Ubuntu, seems pretty quick and pretty straightforward. It sets it up by default on port 8080. And then we'll basically get up a screen that says it's about to start. Once it's up and running, then you've essentially got your CI server. It's not much use at this point, obviously. It doesn't have anything relevant to us. It's not got anything specific for us to kind of know what to do with it. What we're going to do next is basically add all the other packages that we're going to need, at least at a server level, to ensure that we've got like a full LAMP stack for basically running everything else. So there's a number of different packages that we need to install. I've just put them all in one long line there, but essentially PHP, a number of different PHP plugins, a couple of plugins for a couple of packages even for SQLite. MySQL server ones, although in theory you could run this without that, but I think there's some SQLite parts that need MySQL parts. So yeah, ultimately it makes sense to install MySQL. Just setting the root password, definitely sped this bit up. Obviously make a note of that MySQL password as you're going through that part. And then once that's done, you've essentially got all of the different packages that you're going to need from a server perspective. There's one more package that we'll need to install. Whilst everything else is managed through Composer, there's one package that doesn't seem to play well with Composer. So essentially we're going to install that one with pair. So that one is the HTTP request to library. I didn't seem to be able to find a Composer library that worked with the other Phing scripts and everything else, so that's the kind of odd one out at the moment. But once you've got that, everything else is managed with Composer. So now just going and installing Composer. Composer is pretty straightforward to install. You essentially only need 2 commands to get that running. And this is to install Composer globally on the server. So we're just going to download that. And then it's just a case of moving Composer somewhere to your path. It feels really weird. It's like magically tight.
Yeah, it's a nice way to make sure your things don't go wrong in your presentation, though.
Oh, absolutely.
Whoops, we lost our network connection.
Yeah. That's it. So I'm just testing that Composer works by just running Composer, and that tells me all the commands that are available. Okay, so yeah, just to recap what we did. We installed and started Jenkins. We installed the required server packages for that. We installed Composer globally. And now we can move on to the kind of next part, I believe. Sorry. There's about 1 million hidden bullet points there. And so next we're going to configure Jenkins and just add all the plugins that we need to basically get this Jenkins set up working the way that we want it to. So we essentially just go straight to the Manage Plugins within the Manage Jenkins section. You can click on Available. Go on. There we go. And then you can search at the top to see what plugins that you want. So we're going to install PHP, and that's the Phing plugin there. And then linked to that Jenkins PHP template is actually a PHP plugin which goes off and enables about another 7 or 8 different plugins. And then additionally we're going to install the GitHub plugin. There's a million different GitHub plugins, but we only really want this one because it's just the straightforward one that's going to give us the majority of that GitHub integration. And then when you hit save, that just goes off and installs all of those. There seems to be a really weird issue in the latest build of Jenkins. You probably can't see it here, but the save button seems to get cut off. So if at any point you see like an odd kind of quarter of a save button, that's why. But there's actually an issue that I've seen around for someone to resolve that. But I guess that's kind of one of the bonuses of using open source stuff.
But it's broken.
Yes, that's quite right. Okay, so by default there's no security with Jenkins. When you install it, it just basically comes out of the box with nothing. It's basically open for the entire world to see. You have to secure it via a number of different methods. You can link it in with your Linux users, or you can have its own user database. There's a number of other ways that you can link it with LDAP. But essentially, one of the first things you'll need to do, as soon as you've got everything else working, is kind of set up a user scenario where you're kind of locking it down to just the people that you want to see it. Alternatively, you could restrict access to the server on certain IPs or whatever. And then once you've installed everything, you've got to go off and restart Jenkins before anything else will work. Sorry, I put together these videos very late last night. I was like, oh, which bits can I speed up? But, definitely should speed up there. Okay, so now we're just going to add a couple more configurations to our Jenkins instance. So, as I mentioned earlier, we need to tell Jenkins, or at least the Jenkins user, where all of its packages are going to be, so that when our Jenkins jobs run, it knows where it's going to be running from. So essentially, our composer file is going to install all of our packages into our workspace under a /bin directory. And then within that, there'll also be another vendor directory, which is where it's pulling everything down to. So you can configure environment variables for Jenkins here. So we're just going to basically add an variable for path, and then we're going to put in workspace /bin path to basically tell it that that's where some of the packages are going to live. And then additionally, we're going to need to configure Phing at an environment level for Jenkins, and basically tell Jenkins where its Phing instance is going to be. So configure system. Scroll down, and then you can basically add Phing there. You basically just go, Phing is going to be in this directory here. This will essentially be the Phing home, which is going to be, again, workspace, vendor. Hurry up. Yeah, so workspace, vendor, Phing. There you go, there's the funny button. Okay, so now essentially that's Jenkins at least kind of primed to have all of its plugins and have all the configuration in place, ready to basically start building with, really. But what we don't have is any sort of a template to work with. So as I said earlier, the PHP Jenkins template and the Drupal PHP Jenkins template have kind of templates that you can use and you can install those. But what I've created is one that kind of works specifically in this scenario, and also it comes out of the box linked to this Git repo which I've created. Okay, so now we SSH back into the server, and we're going to basically copy down this config.xml file and then reload Jenkins. So we switch into the Jenkins user. And then we're basically going to navigate to where Jenkins lives and to the jobs directory within that. So we're basically going to var lib Jenkins, which is the default on Ubuntu. Obviously it can be different on other distros. And then essentially we're going to make a directory for this job. So we're just going to call it Drupal template. And then we're going to go into that directory, and then all we're going to have to do now is basically navigate to the repo which I've set up. You could obviously set up another repo where we have a repo just for the XML file, git clone it down. For the purposes of this demo, and for the purposes of just making this really, really quick, I've just set this up so that it's just a config file. If you just pull it down, then you can get going basically. So on GitHub, we're just going to go and get the raw URL just to this file, and then basically go back, and then just do a wget and just pull this file down into this directory. It's important to remember that you have to be the Jenkins user to do this. A number of times I did this demo, and there was the root user, and it obviously didn't work. So then we just basically reload the configuration from disk, and when we reload it, when it comes back up again, we'll have a new job ready for us to use. So that's quite useful if you want to kind of share around templates with other people, obviously. It's important to remember that we did all those kind of plugins and all the configurations first, because otherwise your kind of template won't necessarily work because of the required plugin won't be there. Here I've gone into the job, and then essentially I was just going to take you through kind of the anatomy of kind of this Jenkins task really. It will be very, very similar to the way that the PHP one works. I've already kind of hard-coded in these kind of GitHub URLs so you can basically see how it's working right from the off. You can obviously put in credentials so you can set up SSH keys so that it communicates directly with that server. There's some additional behaviors that you can use with Git. Oh, I'm going too fast. You can basically kind of have it clean the directory before it checks out the code. You can use sub-modules, yeah, so we've been doing that on some projects recently where we have a Jenkins job basically check out a code base and then check out further code as well. There might be some Composer integration, but for now what we're doing is just executing a shell command within our workspace and just going Composer install. And then for the Phing integration, essentially you don't really need to do much at all because of out of the box, it's going to look for a build.xml file in your workspace. This setup just kind of has that already there. Each of these steps you shouldn't need to touch necessarily, but what they kind of do is they basically take the reports which this template generates and then puts them into a kind of nice layout for us to review later on. At this point, I'm building the project, specifically doing that so that it creates all the directories and creates that kind of setup ready for us to use. It will be marked as unstable at the end because we haven't done the full configuration with Apache or anything like that yet. But it will certainly kind of go off and kind of get all the dependencies from Composer, and it will still kind of run a bunch of those tests. So once it's gone through, you can see the build's finished. It's collected all of the data from those reports, and then ultimately we'll be able to see that on the right-hand side. I think it needs more than one build before it will show anything, but okay, so the final few steps now. So for this part, we're essentially going to adjust the Apache configuration. There could be other ways of doing this. For now, this kind of seems like the best way. We're essentially just going to configure Apache so that it's publicly accessible. So making some standard changes so that Drupal will basically run. We need allow overrides to be all so that the htaccess file will work. We need rewrite enabled, and then once we restart Apache, then we've kind of done the minimal configuration that we need there. Now what we're going to essentially do is create a vhost for our Jenkins build. Well, actually, no, we'll do this first. You need Jenkins to basically, you need the Apache user to have the Jenkins group in order that it can understand the SQLite file and be able to read and write from that SQLite file. So there's a couple of steps that you have to do here in order to make sure that the www-data user has the right groups. So I'm just making some changes to the www-data user. And once that's done, yeah, the www-data user has now got the Jenkins group. And then we're just going to essentially create a vhost so that our Jenkins workspace exists as a publicly accessible drive site. And the purpose of that is so that all of our simple tests or all of our bhat tests basically will be able to run in a real life scenario. So before this, I've obviously set up a domain and I've pointed that domain at this IP. There's probably other ways you could do it with it kind of testing internally using localhost. We've found that actually kind of having it as a publicly accessible site for people to review as well is pretty useful, and certainly it's kind of useful for us to be able to kind of get people to validate that things are working as expected, even from like a human level as well. So once that's done, I'm just going to. So up here, I basically created a symlink within the root of the server. Basically, created a symlink back to the workspace directory, so that kind of exists. And now I'm just copying the vhost file to a custom vhost file. How would they have timing? What time does this one end?
About 10 minutes time.
10 minutes?
Yeah, I think so.
Right.
Yeah. Trust me, time. Yeah, you got 8 minutes.
8 minutes.
10 minutes lunch. Very quick.
Anyway, you get the idea. Creating a vhost. Okay, so we've configured Jenkins, installed the Drupal Jenkins template, we've done an initial build, and then we've configured Apache. And now it's kind of just up to us to do basically the final build. At which point we can basically review the results. With that Jenkins job, it's configurable, so you can set the levels at which a build is marked as unstable, or where it's marked as like broken. We have it set up so it actually emails anyone who's committed through to it on either of those scenarios. We even get an email come through to us when it actually returns to a stable state. That kind of happens by default with the GitHub plugin. I'm not sure about the other ones, so there is a plugin for Bitbucket and there is some stuff for GitLab. It produces reports where we can basically advise developers on where their code can be improved, so that the integration with Coda and check style basically gives you graphs and kind of indications of kind of where that code doesn't adhere to the standards. So obviously the caveats are, and this is kind of true of any kind of test-driven approach, that there's additional overhead to kind of writing those automated tests, but I think once there's an infrastructure that will support those tests, then it's kind of certainly worth doing. The tests obviously need to be written correctly, so if you're using this as part of a pipeline where you're saying if all the tests pass and are true, then proceed to the next stage of the build, then obviously that's irrelevant if the tests aren't correct in the first place. And and there's obviously an initial project setup overhead. It could certainly be automated, and I'm certain that yeah, using some other deployment tools, you could automate just the whole process of building up a CI task for your project. Tests take time to run, and obviously the more tests you add, and simple tests have got ridiculous overhead. But it's automated on push, so you're basically sending it off somewhere and then waiting for the kind of feedback to come in terms of an email. So there's hosted alternatives to Jenkins. So there's travis.ci, which Mr. Nathan over there can tell you all about, and Circle CI. There's one called magnum.ci, which I'm really fascinated with. Obviously, the benefits of using a hosted CI setup is that the infrastructure is managed by someone else, it's managed elsewhere, and you don't have to build your own DigitalOcean box to basically manage it yourself. You don't have to worry about necessarily security, but obviously it's free for open source. It costs money if you want to kind of pay for it. It is 100% self-contained then. So, like I said, none of this is new ideas. It's all kind of tried and tested, and all things that other people have done before me, probably better. So I wanted to say a massive thanks to these amazing people, some of whom are in the room. So yeah, basically check out all of those links. So, thank you. That's the URL to the GitHub project. Obviously, it's quite a lot longer. That's the actual instructions that will take you through the kind of whole process of setting it up. And these are my details. And obviously, let's kind of discuss this a bit further. I'm interested to see how other people are doing this, and certainly kind of how other people are doing it better and with kind of newer technologies. So, thank you very much. I was going to show you like a build after it's happened with all the metrics and everything, but I'm worried that we're running out of time. So does anyone have any questions or any feedback they want to raise now? Mr. Dan.
There's lots of GUI action in there, setting up tasks and whatnot. What's the alternative to that? Is there a CLI or?
There is a Jenkins CLI. You can basically do it all command line. So certainly with something like Ansible, for example, yeah. You could basically automate that whole process. Yeah. Nathan.
So are you setting up a separate Jenkins environment for each project?
No. So that's just kind of yeah. If you don't have a Jenkins environment, then obviously that kind of applies to certain people who don't necessarily have Jenkins. But then some of the configurations there were specific to the fact that you might not use it in the way that you use Travis. So the composer, like making sure that the composer bin path is there, and the vendor path for Phing and everything like that. So that's kind of slightly different. But yeah, other than that, it's just about kind of.
So do you have one platform that you're using to?
Yeah, we do. Although there's been a couple of scenarios recently where I've had to set it up for other people, and in those cases I was like, well, I'd like to document for my purposes how I go through the process of setting it up for other people. So yeah, it kind of made sense. Any other questions? Okay, thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of
You guys